You've hit on the nub of the issue. The Americans have been trying for years to pivot and focus on the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And allow me to pivot very briefly, I hope, to Russia and Ukraine. Once the Russians prove they can't even reach Kyiv, never mind reaching the Atlantic to then glare malevolently at the United States, at that point, the MAGA Americans who are preparing to come into power say, both to themselves, the American electorate, and then to the Europeans, guys, the game's up.
You've got this one.
Yeah. You've got to sort yourselves out. You've got to defend. We will stick with you if you do defend yourselves, but we are focusing here.
Now, I promised we'd be joined by all the cleverest people here at Cheltenham Literature Festival, and I wasn't lying, so here's another one for you. It's the broadcaster, author and foreign policy expert Tim Marshall. He's here at the festival discussing the 10th anniversary edition of his book, Prisoners of Geography. Hello, Tim.
Hello, you. Unfortunately, that version of Tim couldn't be here. So
Well,
here I am.
You know what? I'll take the one I've got. Let's start off by talking about China. In Prisoners of Geography, you looked at China's rising influence and its battle for supremacy with the United States. That was in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
A lot's happened in the last 10 years in that regard.
It has. You get some things right, you get some things wrong. But what I was feeling towards 10 years ago was that we would go back to a form of bipolar world and a form of Cold War. And I think we're certainly in the Cold War, and I think we are still heading towards a bipolar world. I mean, you have to understand the nuances are different to the previous iteration, but as long as you understand that, I think it's a useful template that instead of the Soviets and the Americans, it's now the Chinese and the Americans and who falls in behind them. And we are seeing pressure over and over again on countries to fall in on one block or the other.
So, I mean, in the UK, I mean, I guess on the China side of that equation, we're tangling with the twin needs to protect ourselves from China, while also needing to trade with China, which is a far more complicated situation than it was with the Soviet Union, for example, where we could just hold them away.
We didn't want their Kalashnikovs, we didn't want their tractors, and they didn't build very much else.
Yeah.
Not quite the same thing with China, and that does put us in an invidious position, especially when push comes to shove and we are really leaned on, notably by the Americans. But there's a balance to be had, and I don't think we're doing it very well. I don't think we are quite tough enough when it comes to national security, and the Americans are very exasperated with us about that. But, you know, push comes to shove, and they will both push and shove. We will fall in mostly into the American bloc.
Do you think there is something about... I'm fascinated by what the American view is of our relationship with China and how we're adapting to China. The extent to which America's been kind of sort of has looked a bit like it's been trying to push all its traditional allies away of late, which obviously, if we're talking about a bipolar world, means that they're going to be attracted somewhere else instead. Do you think the White House has a slightly different view about that than it perhaps had 6 months ago?
Well, only a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
You've hit on the nub of the issue. The Americans have been trying for years to pivot and focus on the Indo-Pacific. And allow me to pivot very briefly, I hope, to Russia and Ukraine. Once the Russians prove they can't even reach Kyiv, never mind reaching the Atlantic to then glare malevolently at the United States, at that point, the MAGA Americans who are preparing to come into power say, both to themselves, the American electorate, and then to the Europeans, guys, the game's up.
You've got this one.
Yeah. You've got to sort yourselves out. You've got to defend. We will stick with you if you do defend yourselves, but we are focusing here.
I mean, that's not quite how they put it. But
that's what underpins it.
That's what underpins it, sure. Yeah.
And I agree with you that in the past 6 months, perhaps some of the more nuanced things have been got into Mr. Trump's mind, that it is good to have friends. But what they have bet, what they have gambled, I suspect, is that they know, push comes to shove, which way we will line up, and we will line up behind them. And you saw what happened in, I've called it Smarm El Sheikh, but in Sharm El Sheikh this week, I mean, the smarminess was off the scale. You saw naked American power and everybody lining up behind it because they're frightened of annoying them. So that's what they've bet. they had something called strategic restraint, where we all pretend that they're the first amongst equals when really they're just first and we're not equals. But they have dropped, because the MAGA Americans are robust, shall we say. They've dropped that pretense and they've said, we're in charge, make your choices, and if you make the wrong ones, you're on your own.
Yeah, sure. Look, your book, which became a huge bestseller, is about how geography determines history. You say, for example, that China will never end up at war with India because of the Himalayas in the way. What can that theory tell us about China and Europe?
That's less geographic, except for the fact they've built out their economic empire worldwide. What the Himalayas prevent major mechanized warfare between India and China. Of course, this sort of thing doesn't apply.
There are other types of war available. Yes, yeah.
Well, yes. Yeah. What they do with Europe is both invest in ports. They own, huge amount of real estate in European ports. They invest in our companies, not least, according to the Times story today, which I tend to believe that in our national security infrastructure companies.
Yeah.
They invest in our they tried to, our nuclear industry. They're trying to build an embassy where some of our most sensitive cabling will run right underneath it. And we are still asleep at the wheel, because their relationship with Europe is that we can get right inside these guys because they're wide open. We can't get inside America because they have for years been arguing, accepting there is this threat, and we are still asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, we think we very much resisted the idea of there being that threat. So I guess, look, to link both these points we've been discussing together, how worried is America about us, about our closeness to China, about our vulnerability to China? Does the stories we've seen this week, does that sort of confirm a kind of viewpoint among the Americans?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying they're right, but they are certainly exasperated. And this story will further exacerbate their frustration with us. I mean, for example, our universities, the Chinese are so deep inside our universities because they're clever enough to realize about the long march through the institutions. Yep. I'm sure you know your Gramsci, and I'm sure they do, as they're nominally communists. They have understood that the long march through the institutions includes the universities, and they are so deep inside our universities. They're deep inside everywhere, and the political class in this country, of many hues, some of them understand it, but for political reasons kind of just put it to one side. The national security class warn them over and over again and are not properly listened to because of trade. I mean, it is a very, very hard choices that have to be made.
Yeah, indeed. And it just all seems sort of particularly sharp this week. Look, thank you very much indeed. Thanks again to Tim Marshall. Tim has been here at the festival discussing the 10th anniversary of his book, Prisoners of Geopgrahy. Great to speak to you, Tim.